Chapter 10. Sophie. Blessing in disguise.
If any of them move, kill them.
Rian ordered the skim on Hort's ear, leaving Hort, Willem and Bogdan trapped in the carriage with the sadistic eel. The second the door closed, Sophie could see the skim start slashing at the boys for sport, and Hort fending it off with kicks and punches as the driver moved the carriage down the road and out of sight. Rian was guiding her towards the church now, past the pen of royal transports from other kingdoms, including crystal carriages, magic carpets, flying broomsticks, levitating ships, and a giant, slobbery toad. A cool wind blew through the darkening courtyard, and Sophie hunched deeper into her white dress. She could feel Rian puff his chest, posturing for the crowd outside, but their attentions suddenly seemed distracted, their eyes fixed overhead.
"What's happening?"
Rian murmured to Bieber, his pirate guard at the door, as he pulled Sophie into the church. Bieber hustled to find out. Meanwhile, the leaders from other kingdoms rose from the pews as Rian took the time to greet each one.
"You say you've caught Tedros's princess?"
spoke an imposing, black-skinned elf with pointed ears, dressed in a ruby and diamond-jeweled tunic.
"No truth to the stories of a rebel army, then?"
The only truth is that Agatha's whimpering in my dungeons as we speak,
said Rian.
"And you still think that she and Tedros were behind the snake's attacks? That they were funding his thugs?"
The elf asked.
"It's a bold claim that you made to the Kingdom Council. I can't say that all of us believe it."
"The attacks have ceased, haven't they?"
said Rian briskly.
"I'd think Agatha and Tedros being in my prison has something to do with it."
The elf scratched his ear, mulling this over. Sophie noticed a silver ring on his hand, carved with unreadable symbols.
"While we're on the subject of the Kingdom Council,"
Rian probed,
"have you given any further thought to my proposal?"
"No further thought is necessary. Lion's Mane may be inspiring the people of the woods, but the school for good and evil is our history,"
said the elf, his accent firm and crisp.
"Dismantle the school, and the Storian has no protection. It has no purpose. Its tales of the graduates of the school are the bedrock of the woods. Its tales teach our world the lessons we need to learn and move our woods forward one story at a time. Your pen can't replace that, no matter how much people are taken with your message."
Rian smiled.
"And yet, what if Lion's Mane wrote a story in the sky for all to see about the mighty elf king of Ladleflop, and how nobly he rules his people? A people who I hear were quite resentful that you didn't do more to stop the snake's attacks. Perhaps I'll have your vote then."
The Elf King stared at Rian. Then he smiled big white teeth and thumped him on the back.
Politics on your blessing day, eh? Shouldn't you be introducing me to your lovely bride?
I only save her for allies,
Rian teased, and the elf king laughed. Smiling blandly behind them, Sophie found herself distracted by the church's facade, newly painted, and its lavish stained glass depicting Rian's slaying of the snake with holy reverence. Stone airways painted with gold lions bevelled along the walls, cooling the hot summer draughts. A perilously old chaplain, with a red nose and hairy ears, waited at the altar, and behind him were 2 thrones, where the king and princess would sit while he gave the blessing. To the left of the altar huddled the church choir in white uniforms and page-boy hats, and to the right hung a cage of tweeting doves, which the priest would free into the woods at ceremony's end. Lucky little doves, Sophie thought. Suddenly, Bieber rushed forward and accosted Rian as he greeted the King of Foxwood. "Lion's Mane, sire, your new message, it's moving." Sophie's eyes widened.
Impossible.
Rian snorted, releasing Sophie and prowling back through the church doors as Sophie hurried after him. The moment she stepped outside, she saw the crowd's faces cocked towards the sky, watching Lion's Mane's message about Agatha's capture. The letters seemed to be quivering against the black storm clouds. "Definitely moving," Sophie wisped.
Things move in the wind,
said Rian, unconcerned. But the message began to quiver faster, faster, as if ungluing from the sky, a pink scar appearing behind each of the dislodged letters. Then all of a sudden, the gold letters lost their shape, melding into each other, one by one, until Lion's Mane's message had collapsed into a single gold ball, swelling bigger, 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 as big as the sun. Lightning ripped through the clouds, the ball detonated, splashing 4 letters in gold across the sky. L-I-E-S. The gold and clouds dispersed, revealing clear morning blue. Silence gripped the courtyard. All down the road, thousands gaped upwards, wondering what they'd just seen, along with the visiting leaders staring in shock through the church doors. Together, they looked at the king, but he was already dragging Sophie inside the church.
"You did something to that message,"
Rian hissed.
"You corrupted it."
"I did I? Just like I poisoned you in the throne room?" Sophie hissed back. "I've been here with you this whole time. When did I have time to conduct a matinee performance of Sorcery in the Sky? It's obvious who did it. The same person who made your tea, the same person who chose to stay behind." She arched an eyebrow. "I wonder why." Rian considered this, his eyes searching hers. He turned to his pirate guard.
Bring my brother here. Now.
"Yes, sire," Bieber mumbled, rushing away. Sophie, meanwhile, did her best to suppress a smile, because it wasn't Japheth who was responsible for what just happened. It was her. She'd snuck a code into Lion's main stories, the one about young Haristo and the one about Agatha today. A code only one person in the entire world could understand. Rian had searched her work for hidden messages, and she'd mocked him for it, insisting she couldn't possibly be capable of hiding a distress call right under his nose. But anyone who truly knew Sophie would have known better. Because Sophie was capable of anything. Not that she'd expected her hidden code to reach its target. It was a shot in the dark, a last-ditch Hail Mary, which is why she'd committed to Hort's nut-brained plan. Yet in the end, it was her plan that had worked, which meant that her friend had not only read her message, but that help was on the way. A dove zipped by. "Agatha's been caught. Have you heard?" Sophie spun to see the cage near the altar emptied of its doves, which was dispersed over the theatre, tweeting in dignitaries' ears, "We saw her captured. She cried for mercy. She's rotting in the dungeons." Confused, Sophie looked up and saw Rian's fingertip glowing behind his back, stealthily directing the birds as he greeted the ice giant of Frost Plains. "Agatha has no army. Don't believe the lies. She was alone when we caught her. Didn't even fight back." Rian swished his finger, and the doves blitzed out the church doors, spreading the king's lies into the crowd, distracting them from the message in the sky. A dove crowed in Sophie's ear. "Agatha's a traitor. Agatha's wicked." Sophie slapped it away, launching it right into the face of a girl in a white dress. "Oh, sorry." "Excuse me, Your Majesty," said the girl, her head lowered with a clipped accent and breathy tone. "I'm conductor of the Camelot Children's Choir, and we'd hoped you might join us in singing a hymn of praise to the noble lion." Sophie scoffed. "A princess sing with the choir? Will the king tingle a timpani too? How absurd! I'll watch you and your friends suck up to the lion from the comfort of my throne. Thank you." Her voice broke off, for the maiden had raised her head, revealing dark hair, pencil-thin eyebrows, and twinkling black eyes. "My choir would really love to have you," said the girl. Sophie followed her eyes to the group of teenagers in matching white uniforms and hats at the front of the church, gazing hard at her. Help wasn't on the way. It had already arrived. As Rian had a heated discussion with the Queen of Jaunt Jolie, Sophie squeezed his arm. "The choir would like me to sing with them. Finally, the famous Sophie," cooed the Queen, draped in a peacock feather stole. She reached out her hand, and Sophie noticed a silver ring with unreadable carvings, just like the one the elf king of Ladleflop wore. "We were just talking about you." A pleasure, Sophie simpered, shaking her hand stiffly before pivoting to Rian. Now, about the choir.
The Queen would like to meet with you, Rian said, but I told her your schedule has filled up.
Whatever you say, darling, the choir is waiting.
I heard you the first time. Stay here and greet the guests, Rian ordered.
Sophie's face fell. If my groom had spoken to me like that, I never would have made it to the altar, the Queen mused to Sophie. Indeed, your schedule only filled up once I told the king that he's turned Camelot's new queen into a lapdog. No speech at the coronation, no presence at meetings, no comment on Tedros's capture or those of your friends, no mention by the king's pen. It's as if you hardly exist. The Queen turned to Rian. Perhaps I'll take Sophie aside and discuss a queen's duties in private. Two queens often succeed in solving problems a king cannot.
Rian glared back at her. Now that I think about it, Sophie, your singing with the choir sounds like a good idea.
Sophie didn't need to ask twice. As she escaped, she saw Rian whispering aggressively to the Queen, his hand gripping her arm. A moment later, Sophie gripped onto the choir conductor's arm. Shall we rehearse in the priest's chambers? Yes, Your Majesty. The conductor pipped, and her choir mates scurried after Sophie like chicks behind a swan. Sophie listened to the patter of feet, a wicked grin spreading across her face. The Queen of Jaunt-Jolie was right. It had taken two queens to solve this problem, and now the king would pay the price. The priest's sanctum reeked of leather and vinegar, its mess of books and scrolls veiled by dust. Sophie locked the door and shoved a chair against it before she twirled to the choir. My babies, my poopsies come to save their dean, she cooed, hugging her first years starting with the conductor. Miss Valentina, mi amor. And hello, Aja. You remember my name? Squeaked the boy with dyed red hair. How could I not? You dressed like me for Halloween and wore the most divine boots. And Bodie, Lathan, and Devon, my scrumptious ever boys, and lovely Lara Lisa, my cleverest witch, and my beloved Nevers, Drago and Rowan, and dirty Marley. Sophie frowned. Who are those? In the corner of the room, a few kids in shirt sleeves and underpants were helping each other out a high window. The real choir, Devon answered. Switched clothes with us because they're from Camelot and don't trust Rian and think Tedros is king. Plus, you gave us gold, added the last choir boy, falling out the window with a yelp, coins trailing behind him. Devon looked at Sophie. Tried to tell them the courier's right, that the snake is alive, and that he's Rian's twin, and that Agatha has a secret army. But even Tedros's biggest fans didn't believe us."
"Would you believe it? It sounds ridiculous," said Sophie. "But wait, tell me about Agatha. She's safe, isn't she? We have to check the quest map."
She reached for her shoe, but Valentina grabbed her by the shoulders. "Señorita Sophie, there's no time. Where is the royal carriage, the one that brought you here?"
"Somewhere near the church."
"Who's guarding it?" Bodhi asked, pulling a folded-up cape from a bag.
"One of the snake's skims. Hort, Bogdan and Willem are there too," said Sophie. "They're trapped inside with it."
5 boys, 1 eel. We'll take those odds, said Bodhi, slipping the shimmery cape over him as he and Lathan swept towards the window. For a second, Sophie was distracted by the cape, which looked familiar. But then she realized what they were saying. "You're attacking the royal carriage?" The 2 boys smiled as they straddled the window, Bodhi hugging Lathan under his cloak. "More like reclaiming it," piped Bodhi.
"For Tedros,"
chimed Lathan. They backflipped off the ledge and disappeared like ghosts. Sophie put a hand to her chest. Who needs Tedros with boys like that? A hard knock on the door. Sophie and her students whipped their heads forward.
"The king wants to begin,"
the priest's hoary voice called as Aja held the door shut.
"Coming,"
said Valentina, spinning to Sophie. "We need to get you to school, Señorita Sophie. Here's the plan. You'll sing Budova's hymn to the lion with us."
"Can we sing something else? I don't know that song,"
Sophie wisped.
"Dios mío, it doesn't matter if you know it. Just sing it,"
Valentina snapped.
"And when we get to the phrase, 'Oh, virile lion,' duck,"
said Aja.
"That's the plan,"
Sophie said, perplexed.
"Duck?"
A scratching noise echoed overhead, and Sophie looked up to see 2 kids in black masks scooting through a cramped stone airway. They lowered their masks, revealing blonde Bert and blonder Beckett.
"Definitely duck,"
they said.
"Today, we bless young Rian and Sophie as a reminder that despite all the festivities to come, marriage is first and foremost a spiritual union,"
spoke the old priest before a quiet audience.
"There is no way to tell if a marriage is favored, of course. First, Arthur marries Guinevere in the throes of love, only to have that love be his downfall. Then I planned to marry Arthur's eldest son, Tedros, to his own princess, only to discover Tedros isn't Arthur's eldest son at all. And now, a stranger from Foxwood and the witch of woods beyond seek my blessing to be king and queen of Camelot. So, what do I know?
The priest hacked a laugh.
But no marriage can outwit the pen of fate. All we can do is let the story unfold. In time, the truth will be written, no matter how many lies someone might tell to obscure it. And the truth comes with an army.
Sophie could see Rian glaring at the back of the priest's head as he perched in his throne on the elevated stage. The dignitaries seemed oblivious to the priest's message, but the king had heard it loud and clear. He may have expunged those loyal to Tedros from the castle, but he'd have no such ally in the church. Rian sensed Sophie watching him and glanced over at her, ensconced with the choir. He gave her a baffled look, as if he knew he'd agreed to let her sing with them but couldn't remember why.
Before I read from the scroll of Pelagus, we'll begin with a hymn,
said the priest, nodding at his singers. Sophie's students tilted their faces beneath their hats so the priest wouldn't see his choir had been hijacked.
Ordinarily, Camelot's choir sings to exalt a sacred power that unites us all,
the priest continued, dwarfed by a giant lion head casting a glow on his altar.
But today, the choir has chosen to sing about our new king instead.
Rian's glare deepened behind him.
And, in a further departure from the norm, the choir shall be joined by our new princess. I assume as either a loving tribute to her husband-to-be, or a desire to show off her many talents.
All at once, the congregation turned towards Sophie, who was now the focus of more than 200 royals, good and evil both. Sophie could see the gorgeous, dark-skinned king of Pasha Dunes and his chic, bald-headed wife watching her. Seated nearby was the Maharani of Mahadeva, dripping in jewels, with her 3 sons, while in front of them the Queen of Jaunt Jolie looked anxious and chastened. Far different from the bold woman who'd just confronted Rian. All of their eyes were on Sophie. She'd always dreamed of a moment like this, spotlit on a grand stage, an audience of luminaries, all of them knowing her name. Only in her dreams, she'd rehearsed. Sophie stared at the sheet music in front of her. O Holy Lion, Buddhava's Hymn of Praise. She peeked at her first years, Aja, Devon, Laurelisa and more, their bodies tense, their pupils dilated. Only Valentina looked calm as she presided over the choir, and gazed hard at Sophie, as if to remind her of her cue. Sophie's heart thumped so hard she could feel it in her throat, not just because she hadn't a clue what would happen on that cue, but because she was about as good at reading music as she was at building cabinets, which is to say, not at all. Valentina raised her arms and brought them down, commencing the organist. Arja started 2 beats early, the rest of the choir 2 beats too late. Glory be, O holy Lion, glory be our King. His mercies shall endure, ever faithful, ever sure. Sophie saw Rian gaping like he'd been shot. Dignitaries rocked back in their seats. The church reverberated with the most strikingly awful sound imaginable, like a family of cats being dragged up a mountain. The worse they sounded, the more rattled Valentina looked, as if whatever plan was coming might be brought down by the singing before it, especially since Aja kept shimmying his hips either out of nerves or in an attempt to distract from the horror. Sophie, for her part, tried to dominate the chorus, but Dirty Marley just kept wailing notes louder like a dying mountain goat. Devon, meanwhile, was cute as a button, but had a voice like a Sasquatch, and his girlfriend Lara Lisa unleashed a string of braying yelps like a broken jack-in-the-box. Worst of all, the stone walls and airways bounced the noise mercilessly, as if it was less a church and more some kind of echo torture chamber. Mortified, Sophie held her sheet music higher over her face so she couldn't see the crowd and they couldn't see her. But in her new sightline, she caught Bert and Beckett scooting like roaches through an airway overhead. Sophie's eyes flicked back to Rian, who hadn't noticed the masked spies because he was already lurching out of his throne to stop this inferno. Panicked, Sophie whirled to Valentina, who saw Rian coming and accelerated her conducting, waving her arms wildly, which led her charges to motormouth through the song like overfed chipmunks, the organist chasing to keep up as the chorus barreled headlong into their cue. Glory be our King, glory be, O virile lion. Sophie ducked. Crack, crack, crack! Flaming green-yellow bombs ripped through the theatre like fireworks, sending the crowd diving under their pews. Devon and Lara Lisa tackled Sophie to the ground as sparks sprayed over them and the audience's screams filled the church. Shell-shocked, Sophie covered her ears, waiting for the next blast. Nothing happened. Sophie raised her head. So did the spectators, their screams dissipating. Then came the smell. Like the fumes of a flaming dung heap, a stench so stultifying that the shrieks began again, this time with mortal urgency, as people fled the church in swarms. "Come on!" Devon yelled at Sophie, dragging her towards the doors as Lara Lisa tried to clear a path for them, shoving gaudily dressed royals out of the way. "Use your finger glow," Sophie barked, holding her nose. "Our forest leader didn't teach us how yet," said Lara Lisa, head-butting a witch queen aside. "We're behind the other group." A regally dressed Cyclops sideswiped her as he stormed for the exit, flinging Laurelisa backwards into the crowd. "That one-eyed cretin!" Devon seethed, rushing to save her. "What about me?" Sophie squeaked, trapped in the stampede. The smell in the church was so putrid now that kings were fainting, queens masking their faces with capes, and princes shattering stained glass to escape with their princesses. Overhead, Sophie spotted Bert and Beckett lighting another dung missile. "I have to get out," she choked, hiking her dress collar over her nose, but the doors were still so far. The ice giant of frost plains thundered by, smacking people away and barreling towards the exit. Instantly, Sophie started scurrying behind him like a mouse in the wake of an elephant, while the giant swatted left and right, his huge ice-blue hand flashing the same silver ring she'd seen on the Elf King and the Queen of Jaunt Jolie. Through his legs she spotted open doors and clear sky ahead. A comet streaked through the air outside, a helix of navy and pink like a sailor's flare. Did Bert and Beckett dung-bomb the streets, too? Suddenly she glimpsed Bert and Beckett using a rope to climb down a stone wall towards the doors, before the boys yelped and reversed direction as Aaron, Wesley, and more pirate guards leapt onto the rope to chase them. Sophie knew she should stay and help the boys. A real dean would protect her students, evers and nevers. But instead, she found herself scampering faster for the doors behind the giant, hiding in his shadow so that pirates tracking Bert and Beckett wouldn't see her. She didn't bother feeling guilt over it. She wasn't Agatha, after all. She wasn't good. Those boys needed to fend for themselves. That was the point of fairy tales. And she? Well, she needed to get as far from Camelot as possible. She was nearing the exit now, hugging closer to the giant's boots. If she could just slither out of this church, she could blend into the mob. She could disguise herself and find a way back to school. To Agatha. The thought of seeing her best friend again made Sophie dump caution. She broke away from the giant and sprinted between his legs, elbowing people out of her path. She felt the heat of the sun flush across her skin, and as she crashed through the doorway, she looked up into the heavenly white glare. A hand snatched her backwards, and she whirled to see Rian in the doorway. "Stay with me," he said, rattled. "We're under attack." Suddenly, loud bells jangled in the distance, frantic and high-pitched. Alarm bells. Sophie and Rian swiveled and saw Camelot shrouded by an alien fog, silver and glimmering, that obscured the entire castle. Behind the fog, they could hear shouts echo from the towers, resounding downhill as the bells clattered wilder and faster. "What's happening?" Sophie breathed. "Intruders," said Rian, clasping her wrist tighter. "They're at the castle, too." "Japheth! He might still be there. He's alone. We have to help him." He yanked Sophie through the door, but it was mayhem outside, with dignitaries still fleeing the church, now mixing with the hordes of citizens in the streets who'd smelled the stink bombs and heard Camelot's alarms and joined the stampede like harrowed geese. At the same time, a heap of these spectators from far-flung kingdoms saw Rian and Sophie emerge and flooded towards them, desperate to meet the new king and queen. Cornered, Rian pulled Sophie back to the door, but that only got them caught deeper in the crush, like buoys in a storm. But now Sophie saw someone streaking through the mob on horseback, smashing people aside. Japheth.
"The dungeons,"
he panted at his brother, his gold and blue suit sprayed with white rubble.
"They've been breached."
A cry tore through the sky overhead. It wasn't human. Rian, Japheth and Sophie raised their eyes. A flock of stymphs ripped out of the fog, carrying Sophie's friends on their spines. Kiko, Rena, Beatrix, Dot, with finger glows lit, leaning forward and firing spells at the king and his liege. 3 stun spells hit Rian in the chest, launching him through the open church doors, while another bludgeoned Japheth off his horse. Dot turned the ground beneath Japheth's feet to hot mocha, sending him plunging headfirst into the deep, steaming moat. Doves tweeted as Japheth flailed in boiling chocolate. "Agatha's been caught. She's no match for the lion. She's no match for his liege. Praise to King Rian. Praise to Japheth." A red-skinned demon ate the doves. Sophie wheeled and saw Hester and Annadil on a stymph swooping towards her. "Grab my hand," Annadil ordered. The pale witch reached out her palm as Hester steered their bird downwards, with Annadil's and Sophie's fingers about to touch. A pirate dagger pierced Annadil's arm, hurled by Wesley as he surged out of the church. The witch lunged back in pain, and her stymph bucked, throwing Annadil off its back.
"Annie!"
Hester screamed. Her demon raced to save her friend, but Annadil was falling too fast, her arm outstretched and about to hit the ground first, the dagger in it sure to sever through. A new stymph scooped under her, and Bodhi and Lathan seized Annadil into their arms, swinging her up on their bird. The 2 boys were still in their choir uniforms, their faces and shirts splattered with black eel goo. More stymphs appeared in the fog behind them, carrying Sophie's friends. 2, then 4, then 5. "Help me!" Sophie yelped, hope swelling. But these stymphs were too far into the fog for her to see the riders yet. She jumped and waved at them. "Please, someone, anyone!" But now arrows were streaking towards these stymphs as pirates galloped down from the castle on horseback, bows raised. Spooked, the stymphs veered away from Sophie, retreating into the fog. Bieber and Thiago rose upright onto their horses, balancing feet on the saddles, taking shots at Hester's and Kiko's and Annadil's heads as Sophie's friends ducked and swerved, arrows soaring through the gaps in the stymph's ribs. "Help! Save me!" Sophie screeched at them, leaping uselessly at the stymphs as her friends tried to maneuver towards her. More and more arrows flew as pirate guards poured out of the church, firing at the stymphs in the sky. Beatrix, Hester, Bodhi all tried to dodge and make one last dive for Sophie, but the onslaught was too much. Looking stricken, they had no choice but to flee en masse, away from the church, away from Camelot. and away from Sophie. Sophie's heart plunged. She swiveled back to the castle, but the silvery fog was dissipating, with no more stymphs to reveal. Tears flooded her eyes. She'd been left behind, just like she'd left Bert and Beckett, who were surely dead by now. She didn't know why she was crying. She deserved her fate. She deserved to be punished for her selfishness, punished for the bad deed she couldn't help doing, punished for being herself. That's why her story could never change, no matter what pen wrote it. "Sophie!" a voice blared from above. She raised her head to see a stymph throttling out of the fog, through a hail of arrows, a shirtless boy reaching out his hand to grab her, his face veiled in mist, his hair white as snow. Rafal? He ripped through the fog. No, not Rafal. Time seemed to slow, her heart pumping hot blood as if it was the first time she'd ever seen this boy, even though she'd seen him 1,000 times before. Only she'd seen him differently all those times. Not like she was now. As a prince who'd patiently saved her again and again and again until she finally had the sense to notice. She thrust her hand into the sunlight as he flew down, his hair coated with white rubble, his face and pallid chest streaked in skim wounds, his fingers stretching out to clasp hers. "Got you?" Hort said, starting to tow her onto his stymph. Holding him tight, Sophie climbed towards him. But then she froze cold. So did Hort, following her eyes. So did the pirates, who lowered their bows in shock. High over Camelot's castle, the dissipating fog had congealed into a giant bubble with a girl's face trapped inside of it, levitating like a ghost. The dark-haired girl was magnified, as if reflected by curved glass. Behind her stood an army of students and teachers in the uniforms of good and evil, framed by a school crest on the wall. The girl gazed down at Sophie with big, glistening eyes. "Agatha?" Sophie choked. But her friend was already vanishing into the sky. "I couldn't free them all," Agatha rasped, pressing her hands against the fading bubble. "There's some left, Sophie. I don't know who. I tried to save them. I tried—" "Agatha!" Sophie cried. It was too late. Her best friend had disappeared. Yet Agatha's voice seemed to linger, echoing in Sophie's head. "There's some left. There's some left. There's some left." She felt Hort shake off his daze and clutch her tighter. "Hurry! Get on!" he yelled, yanking her towards his stymph. Only Sophie's face had changed, her body already pulling away from him. Hort's eyes widened, seeing what was about to happen, but Sophie moved too fast, wrenching her hand out of his.
What are you doing?
Hort shrieked. I can't, Sophie breathed. You heard, Agatha, there's some left at the castle. They'll die if I leave them behind.
We'll come back for them,
Hort retorted, seeing the pirates who'd been watching Agatha suddenly aim arrows at him once more. In front of the castle, Japheth was muscling out of Dot's chocolate swamp.
You have to come with me,
Hort thundered, nosing his stymph towards her.
Now!
Sophie recoiled. They're our friends, Hort. My friends.
Don't be stupid. Get on,
Hort pleaded. Sophie lit her finger glow and shot his stymph in the tailbone with a pink flare, sending the bird rocketing forward just as arrows slashed for Hort's skull. Hort tried to veer backwards towards Sophie, but his bird ignored him and soared after the other stymphs as if it knew its duty was to keep its rider safe. With an anguished cry, Hort looked back at Sophie, tears welling, while his stymph whisked him into the horizon without her. Pirates strung their bows one last time, but their arrows fell short, snapping against the church tower brick and showering wooden shards over the crowd. Everything went quiet. Sophie stood alone, rock still. She'd given up a chance to be free, to be with Agatha again, to be safe at school, so she could help people. Her, evil's once queen. She didn't even know who she was saving, or how many. The real Sophie would be halfway to freedom by now. The real Sophie would have saved herself. A prickling dread snaked down her spine, not just because she felt like a stranger in her own body, but because someone was watching her. She raised her head and saw Rian in the church doorway, battered and bruised, his bluish eyes dead cold. And then she knew. He'd seen Agatha in the sky. He'd seen her army. He'd seen everything. But he wasn't the only one. Thousands of people from other kingdoms, including their leaders, stood downhill, their eyes pinned upwards on the clear air as the last flecks of Agatha and her army disappeared. All at once, their eyes moved to the king, watching Rian the way he was watching Sophie, as birds circled overhead, tweeting brightly into silence, "Agatha's caught. She has no army. Did you hear? Praise the lion. Praise the king."